Hello, and welcome. Tonight, you're about to hear 7 true, disturbing feral people encounters from deep within Appalachia. Before we go any further, if you enjoy true horror stories and unsettling encounters, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Turn the lights down, and let's begin. Story 1: Teen Footsteps Beyond the Tree Line. I grew up hearing warnings about the haulers behind my grandmother's place, the kind of warnings adults give children without ever fully explaining. They'd say things like, don't wander past the tree line, don't follow voices at night, and if the dogs go quiet, you come inside and lock the door. Back then, I thought it was just mountain superstition, a way to scare kids into behaving. It wasn't until years later, after my grandmother passed, and I stayed alone in that house for the first time, that I understood those warnings were never meant to scare me. They were meant to prepare me. The house sat at the end of a narrow gravel road that wound through deep Appalachia, miles from the nearest town. Trees crowded in from every direction, old hardwoods and twisted pines packed so tightly they blocked out most of the sky. Even during the day, sunlight struggled to reach the ground. At night, the darkness felt alive, layered and thick, like something you could sink into if you weren't careful. There were no neighbors within shouting distance. Just woods, hills, and hollers that folded into one another like secrets. I decided to stay there for a week to sort through my grandmother's things. I told myself it would be peaceful, a chance to disconnect. The first 2 nights passed quietly enough. The usual sounds of the forest carried on after dark: crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of something small moving through the brush. My grandmother had always kept dogs, and I brought my 2 with me, figuring their presence would make the place feel less empty. They slept on the floor near my bed, alert but calm. On the 3rd night, everything changed. I remember waking up without knowing why. No noise, no nightmare, just that sudden, sharp awareness that something was wrong. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from a thin sliver of moon through the curtains. I lay still, listening. That's when I noticed the silence. The crickets were gone, no owls. No wind in the trees. Even my dogs were quiet. Too quiet. They weren't asleep, they were awake, stiff, their bodies tense against the floor. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not heavy, not rushed. Bare footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the dirt outside the house. They circled once, close enough that I could hear the faint scuff of skin against gravel. Whoever it was walked with an uneven rhythm, like they weren't used to flat ground. I held my breath, my heart pounding, so hard I was afraid it would give me away. The footsteps paused beneath my bedroom window. That's when I heard the breathing. It wasn't loud, but it was close. Wet and steady, drawn in through the nose and released through parted lips. Human breathing. Curious breathing. I stared at the dark shape of the window, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. My dogs didn't bark. They didn't growl. They didn't even whine. They just stayed still, eyes fixed on the window, ears pinned back. I told myself it was a deer. People in the mountains say that all the time. Deer do strange things at night, but deer don't breathe like that. And deer don't drag their fingers along the siding. The scraping sound was soft at first, like someone brushing past the wall. Then it became more deliberate. Nails, fingernails, dragging slowly across wood. Testing it, feeling it. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. The breathing shifted, moved along the wall, stopping near the corner of the house. The footsteps followed, circling it in, never straying far. Minutes stretched into something longer, heavier. Time felt wrong, elastic. I didn't dare reach for my phone. I didn't dare turn on a light. Every instinct told me that whoever, or whatever, was out there knew I was awake. It felt like a waiting game, like it was listening for something, any sign that I might move. Eventually, the footsteps retreated toward the woods. I heard them pacing just beyond the tree line, staying hidden, moving back and forth. The breathing faded, replaced by occasional snaps of twigs and the soft crunch of leaves. I lay there until dawn, muscles aching, eyes burning, afraid to sleep. When the sun finally pushed weak light through the trees, the forest sounds returned as if nothing had happened. I convinced myself I'd imagined it. That illusion shattered the moment I stepped outside. The ground around the house was soft from recent rain, and the footprints were impossible to miss. Bare feet, pressed deep into the mud, circling the house in a slow, deliberate loop. The toes were wide and splayed, the arches barely visible, like the feet weren't used to shoes or pavement. Some prints overlapped, as if whoever made them had walked the same path repeatedly. I followed them to the edge of the woods, where they disappeared among the trees. Against my better judgment, I followed. About 50 yards in, hidden behind a cluster of rhododendron, I found it. A crude lean-to built from fallen branches, scraps of insulation, and pieces of plastic sheeting. Inside were old food cans, chewed open, and a stained blanket that smelled like damp earth and rot. Someone had been living there, watching the house, watching me. I packed my things that afternoon and told myself I'd leave in the morning. I didn't want to drive those roads at night, especially shaken like I was. I convinced myself daylight would bring clarity, that maybe there was a rational explanation. A vagrant, a lost hunter, someone passing through. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, there were two sets. They moved differently from each other. One dragged, uneven and slow. The other was lighter, quicker, almost playful. I heard them whispering low and indistinct, not quite words, but close enough to make my skin crawl. My dogs finally growled, deep and fearful, backing away from the windows. A knock came at the door, just one, soft, knuckles against wood. I didn't answer. The whispering stopped. I heard someone sniffing near the door, long and slow. Another knock followed, harder this time. My heart felt like it was going to tear out of my chest. I crouched behind the bed, clutching a flashlight and a hunting knife my grandmother kept in the nightstand. The handle was worn smooth from years of use. Then the scratching began. Not frantic, not angry. Patient. Fingernails dragging up and down the door, leaving faint lines in the paint. The whispering returned, closer now. One voice sounded like it was trying to form words it didn't fully remember. Inside, it said, drawn out and wrong. I stayed there until morning again. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, the door was scarred with marks, shallow grooves that caught the light at the wrong angles. The dogs refused to go outside. They had to be dragged to the truck, trembling the entire time. As I pulled away, I saw movement at the edge of the trees. Figures standing just inside the shadows, watching me go. I told the sheriff. He listened politely, nodded, wrote a few things down. He told me people wander off into the woods sometimes. Some don't come back the same. He suggested selling the property. I never went back. Months later, a hunter went missing near that area. Then another. Locals whispered about something moving through the hollers again, something that walked like a person but lived like an animal. People said the dogs knew before anyone else. They always go quiet first. Sometimes, late at night, I still dream of that breathing outside the window. And when my house goes too quiet, when the normal sounds of life fade away all at once, I find myself holding my breath, listening for footsteps beyond the tree line, afraid that whatever watched me back then never really stopped. Story 27, the man who wouldn't speak. I was driving those back roads because my job paid mileage, and the more remote the route, the better it paid. That's what I told myself anyway. Truth was, I liked the quiet. I liked the way the mountains swallowed cell signals and expectations alike. Out there, no one could reach you unless they meant to. That afternoon had started like any other, gray sky hanging low, the air thick with summer humidity, the kind that makes your shirt stick to your back even with the windows down. The road wound through hollers so deep the sunlight barely touched the ground, just a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through trees that leaned in like they were listening. My truck sputtered once, coughed like it was clearing its throat, and then died completely. I coasted to the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, and sat there with my hands still on the wheel, waiting for it to start again. It didn't. I turned the key a few more times until the engine just clicked in a tired, final way. No bars on my phone. Not even enough to pretend. I wasn't surprised. That stretch of road was known for it. Miles from the nearest town, farther still from anything that could be called help. I popped the hood and stared at the engine like that might change something. The heat rolled up in waves, the smell of oil and hot metal mixing with damp earth and pine. The woods pressed close on both sides of the road, dense and dark even in the afternoon. No birds, no insects. Just that quiet that feels heavier the longer it lasts. An hour passed, maybe more. Time moved strangely out there. That's when I saw him. He stepped out from the trees on the opposite side of the road. Not sudden, Not sneaking, just there. Like he'd been standing behind the trunks, waiting for the right moment. He was tall, but thin in a way that didn't look healthy. His shoulders hunched forward, as if he wasn't used to standing upright for long. He wore layers that didn't make sense for July. A stained winter coat over a flannel, sleeves frayed and dark with old grime. His beard was thick and matted, tangled with leaves and bits of twigs, and his hair hung in ropes around his face. He stared at me without blinking. I raised a hand, more out of instinct than friendliness. "Hey!" I said, my voice sounding too loud in the still air. "You wouldn't happen to have a phone, would you?" "Truck died on me?" He didn't answer. Just tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to understand the shape of my words. His eyes stayed locked on mine, unblinking, glassy in a way that made my stomach tighten. Then he smiled. It wasn't a wide smile. It barely moved his mouth at all. Just enough to show he knew how. I took a step back toward my truck without realizing it. "I've got water," I added, trying to keep my tone calm. "If you need it." I reached into the cab and grabbed a bottle, holding it out toward him. He leaned forward slowly, sniffing the air around it like an animal testing unfamiliar food. His nose wrinkled. He didn't touch it, just stared at the plastic, turning his head side to side as if trying to place it. Finally he spoke. "Down?" That was it. One word. His voice was rough, unused, like something dragged up from deep inside his chest. He lifted an arm and pointed, not at the road, not at the truck, but into the woods behind him. The trees there were thick, the ground sloping downward into a hollow where the light didn't reach. "No," I said, sharper than I meant to. "I'm not going anywhere. Tao should come eventually." His smile vanished. The change was immediate and unsettling, like a mask being pulled away. His face went flat, eyes narrowing just enough to let me know the friendliness, if it had ever been that, was gone. He took a step closer to the road. Then another. His boots didn't make much sound on the gravel, and that bothered me more than if they had. I backed into my truck and shut the door, locking it with a click that sounded painfully loud. He stopped at the edge of the pavement watching. Not angry, not frantic, just patient. I sat there, hands shaking on the wheel, heart pounding in my ears. He stayed where he was, staring at me through the windshield, occasionally tilting his head again, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. After a while, he stepped back into the trees and disappeared as quietly as he'd arrived. I didn't move. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the road, until the woods bled into one solid mass of darkness. I tried my phone again. Nothing. I thought about walking, but the idea of leaving the truck, of stepping into those trees, made my chest feel tight. I stayed put, windows up, doors locked. That's when I heard movement. Not footsteps on the road, but something shifting in the woods, branches snapping softly, leaves crunching, slow and deliberate. I caught glimpses of motion between the trunks, shapes that might have been deer if they moved like deer. They didn't. They paused too often, changed direction too deliberately. A knock came from the passenger side. Just once. I flinched so hard my seatbelt dug into my shoulder. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I'd see. He stood there, closer than before, his face just beyond the glass. I hadn't heard him approach. He leaned in, sniffing again, breath fogging the window slightly. His eyes flicked down to the lock, then back to me. He said again, softer this time, almost coaxing. I shook my head, unable to speak. He straightened, stepped back, and melted into the darkness. The woods swallowed him whole. Night fell hard out there. No gradual fade. One moment there was still some color left in the sky. The next it was gone. The road vanished beyond my headlights, the beam swallowed by fog creeping in low and thick. Sounds returned then, too many of them. Whispers of movement all around me. Not loud. Never loud. Just enough to let me know I wasn't alone. I saw them then. Not clearly, figures moving between the trees, staying just far enough back that I couldn't be sure how many there were. 2, 3, maybe more. They moved differently from each other, one dragging a foot, another darting forward and back like it couldn't stay still. A handprint appeared on my window. Then another. They weren't slamming or trying to force their way in. They traced the glass with their fingers, nails clicking softly, exploring. Learning. My breathing sounded thunderous in my own ears. I crouched low in the seat, hoping they couldn't see me clearly. Hours passed like that. Or minutes. Time lost its meaning. At some point, the noises faded. The figures retreated into the woods, leaving only the hum of insects and the distant call of something I couldn't place. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every creak of the truck made me flinch. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, the road reappeared inch by inch. The woods looked almost normal again, if you ignored the footprints. Bare feet in the dirt around my truck, pressed deep, circling it. Leading away from the road and down into the hollow he'd pointed to. A tow truck arrived late that morning. The driver didn't say much at first, just hooked up my truck and started working. I finally asked if anyone lived out here. He paused, glanced at the woods, then shook his head. Not like you mean. I told him what happened. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly. When I finished, he sighed. Locals don't stop on this road, he said. People go missing. Sometimes they find remains. Sometimes they don't. What about them? I asked. He shrugged. Some folks don't leave the mountains when things go wrong. They adapt. I don't drive that road anymore. But sometimes, when I'm stuck in traffic or my phone loses signal for just a second, I think about that man stepping out of the trees like he'd been waiting all along. And I wonder how many others followed him down into the woods, thinking help was just a little farther in. Story 3, Screaming from the Creek Bed. I'd camped along that creek more times than I could count. It cut through a long stretch of forest I'd been hiking since I was a kid, fed by cold springs higher up the mountain. My dad used to bring me there every fall, teaching me how to pitch a tent on high ground, how to read weather in the trees, how to listen. He always said the creek was safe as long as you respected it, and for most of my life, I believed him. That trip, I went alone. I told myself I needed the quiet. Work had been grinding me down, days blurring together, and the woods felt like the only place that still made sense. The trailhead was empty when I parked. No other cars. No fresh boot prints. Just damp leaves and the low, steady sound of water moving over stone. I hiked in a couple miles before setting up camp on a flat patch near the creek bend, far enough from the trail that I couldn't see it anymore. By late afternoon, the light filtered through the canopy in that familiar Appalachian way, broken and uneven. I cooked a simple meal, listened to the creek, watched the woods settle. Everything felt normal, comfortable. I remember thinking how quiet it was, but in a good way, the kind of quiet you earn by walking far enough from everyone else. Night fell slow and heavy. The forest filled with the usual sounds: insects, distant owls, water slipping over rocks. I crawled into my sleeping bag feeling relaxed, almost proud of myself for finally getting away. I fell asleep easily. Sometime after 2 in the morning, I woke up to screaming. It wasn't close enough to be right on top of me, but it was close enough that it jolted me upright. A high-pitched, desperate sound that cut straight through the trees and into my chest. It wasn't an animal. I knew that instantly. I'd grown up around wildlife. I knew the difference between a fox cry and a human voice. This was human, terrified, raw. I sat there for a moment, heart racing, listening. Another scream tore through the woods, closer this time, echoing along the creek bed. It sounded like someone in pain, someone begging without words. I didn't think it through. I didn't grab my keys or pack anything useful. I just grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent, calling out, "Hello, is someone there?" The screaming stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stood there with the flashlight shaking in my hand, listening for movement, for anything. After a few seconds, I convinced myself the person had collapsed or passed out, that they needed help. I followed the creek upstream, beam cutting through the darkness in a narrow tunnel. The rocks were slick, the ground uneven, and the air felt colder down near the water. My footsteps sounded too loud in my ears. Every few yards, I stopped and listened. That's when I saw movement. At first, I thought it was deer. Low shapes near the opposite bank, crouched close to the water. I swung the flashlight toward them, expecting eyes to scatter and bodies to bolt away. They didn't. The light caught their faces, and my stomach dropped. They were people. Not standing, not moving away. Crouched low, almost squatting, bodies angled toward me. Their clothes were layered and filthy, hanging off them in ways that didn't fit, hair matted and tangled. Skin pale in the beam, stretched tight in places, smeared with dirt. Their eyes reflected wrong, not bright like animals, but dull, confused, as if the light itself offended them. No one spoke. We just stared at each other across the creek. Then one of them laughed. It was a dry, broken sound, like someone trying to remember how laughter worked. It echoed briefly against the rocks before cutting off. Another shifted position, fingers digging into the mud. I realized then that there were more of them than I'd first seen, shapes tucked behind trees, half hidden by brush, all facing me. The screaming hadn't been a cry for help. It had been bait. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I turned and ran. I slipped twice on wet rocks, nearly went down hard, but adrenaline kept me upright. I could hear movement behind me now, feet splashing in shallow water, branches snapping, breathing that wasn't mine. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I burst into my campsite, grabbed my keys from inside the tent, and sprinted to my truck. I slammed the door shut and locked it, hands shaking so badly I dropped the keys once before getting them into the ignition. The engine turned over, coughed, then started. Headlights flooded the campsite, cutting through the trees. I saw shapes retreating at the edge of the beam, melting back into darkness. I didn't drive. I don't know why. Maybe instinct. Maybe fear of hitting something I couldn't see on that narrow road. I just sat there with the engine running, lights on, waiting. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. Something brushed the side of the truck. Then another sound, soft, deliberate scratching near the back window. I held the steering wheel so tight my hands ached. Shadows moved beyond the headlights, just out of reach, circling. At some point, exhaustion set in. Not sleep, exactly, but that numb state where your body can't keep reacting at full panic anymore. The sounds faded slowly, one by one, until only the creak remained. I stayed in that truck until the sky began to lighten, afraid that if I stepped out, they'd be waiting. When morning came, the woods looked almost peaceful again. Mist hung low over the creek. Birds returned cautiously. I stepped out of the truck with stiff legs and walked toward my campsite. My tent was destroyed. The fabric had been shredded down one side, torn open like something had dug through it with bare hands. My food was gone. Not scattered, gone. Coolers tipped, bags emptied cleanly. And on the windows of my truck, there were handprints. Not smeared like someone trying to climb in. Pressed flat. Fingers splayed wide. Too many of them. I packed what little I could salvage and left without hiking back to the trailhead. I drove straight out, tires spinning on wet dirt, not stopping until I hit pavement. When I finally got cell service, I called it in. I didn't know what else to do. The ranger who met me later that day listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he nodded slowly and said they'd look into it. He asked me where exactly I'd camped, then marked something on his map and closed it again. He told me people go missing near creeks more often than anywhere else. Said water carries sound in strange ways. Makes it easy to misjudge distance. Easy to follow the wrong thing. I asked him about the people I saw. He didn't answer directly. Just said there were old stories about folks who went too deep into the woods and never really came back. People who learned how to live without being seen. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't hike at night, and if I ever hear screaming in the woods again, I know better now. Some sounds aren't meant to be answered. Story 4: Living beneath the abandoned mine. I moved into that trailer because it was cheap and because no one else wanted it. That should have been my first warning. It sat on the edge of a long, forgotten coal road, half swallowed by weeds and briars, backed up against a wooded ridge scarred by an old mine shaft that hadn't been worked since before I was born. The landlord didn't say much when he showed it to me. He unlocked the door, gestured at the interior, and shrugged like the place spoke for itself. When I asked about the mine, he waved a hand and said it was sealed and safe, like he was repeating something he'd heard years ago and never bothered to question. I needed somewhere to live, and the rent was low enough that I didn't ask more. The trailer itself was small but serviceable. Thin walls, warped floors, the smell of dust and old oil baked into everything. At night, the woods pressed in close, branches scraping the aluminum siding when the wind picked up. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of living out there: animals, weather, the land settling. Appalachia is full of old noises if you listen long enough. That was something my grandfather used to say. The mountains remember things, and sometimes they remind you. The first week passed quietly enough. I worked days, came home tired, cooked simple meals, and fell asleep to the chorus of insects outside. During the day, the mine looked like nothing more than a dark slit in the hillside, half collapsed, surrounded by rusted warning signs that had long ago faded to white. Vines crept over the entrance, and loose rocks spilled down the slope like the earth itself was trying to bury the thing. At night, though, it felt closer. It started with the rocks. I'd be lying in bed, lights off, when I'd hear it, a soft, shifting sound beneath the floor. Not a thump or a bang, but a slow, deliberate scrape, like stones being moved by careful hands. The first time it happened, I froze, listening hard, waiting for it to repeat. When it did, I told myself it was settling. Old foundations do that, trailers creak. Mines collapse. But it didn't sound like collapse. It sounded intentional. The noises came most nights after that, always late, always subtle. Sometimes it was rocks. Sometimes it was a faint tapping, rhythmic and irregular, like someone testing the walls of something hollow. I tried wearing headphones. I tried leaving the TV on low for background noise. It didn't help. The sounds seemed to slip through everything, threading their way into my thoughts until I couldn't tell if I was hearing them or imagining them. Then the voices started. At first, I thought it was the wind funneling through the vents beneath the trailer, carrying echoes from somewhere else. The land dipped and rose in strange ways out there, and sound traveled farther than it should. I'd hear murmurs, too low to make out words, drifting up from the ground like breath through soil. I'd sit up in bed, heart pounding, straining to listen. One night, I caught a word, my name. It was whispered, drawn out and uncertain, like someone trying it on for size. I sat bolt upright, every hair on my arm standing on end. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just listened as the whisper faded back into nothing. After that, the voices came more often. Sometimes they argued, sharp and hushed, like people fighting not to be overheard. Sometimes they cried, the sound muffled and distant, heavy with exhaustion. Sometimes they laughed, quick bursts of sound that cut off too abruptly. And sometimes, too often, they said my name. I stopped sleeping. I started noticing other things during the day. Food would go missing from my cabinets. Not much at a time. A can here. A loaf of bread lighter than it should be. I blamed myself at first, convinced I was forgetting what I'd eaten. Then I found muddy footprints behind the trailer, leading toward the mine. They were barefoot, toes spread wide, heels pressed deep into the soft earth. I told myself it was kids. Teenagers messing around. Locals who knew the woods better than I did, but no one ever came by during the day. No cars, no voices, just the woods and the mine and the constant feeling of being listened to. One evening, after a particularly bad night of whispers and scraping, I decided I needed answers. Fear has a way of building on itself when you don't confront it. I told myself I'd walk down there, look at the mine entrance in daylight, prove to myself that nothing was happening. That it was all in my head. The footprints were fresh. They started near the trailer and led straight toward the mine, pressed into the damp soil like whoever made them hadn't bothered to hide their trail. I followed them slowly, every step heavier than the last. The closer I got, the colder the air felt, even with the sun still high overhead. The entrance loomed ahead of me, dark and jagged, the smell of earth and rust thick in my nose. The mine wasn't sealed. Boards had been pulled away, stacked carelessly to one side. A narrow opening yawned behind them, just wide enough for a person to slip through. The footprints disappeared into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, listening. The woods were quiet in that unnatural way that sets your nerves on edge. No birds, no insects, just the faint, steady drip of water echoing from somewhere deep inside. I should have turned back. Instead, I stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately, the air damp and stale. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, catching on jagged rock and old support beams blackened with age. The ground was uneven, scattered with loose stones and debris. I moved slowly, careful not to make noise, every sense screaming at me to leave. The tunnel sloped downward, twisting just enough that the light from outside vanished within a few steps. The further I went, the stronger the smells became, sweat, mildew, something sour and human. I heard movement ahead of me, soft and hurried, like someone shifting their weight. I rounded a bend and nearly dropped the flashlight. There were beds, crude ones, made from stolen clothes, old blankets, and plastic tarps layered over flattened cardboard. They were arranged along the tunnel walls, tucked into alcoves where the ceiling dipped lower. Canned food was stacked neatly nearby, labels peeled away. Empty bottles lined the ground, some filled with murky water. People had been living there. I took a step back, my foot crunching on loose rock. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Somewhere deeper in the mine, voices rose in response, sharp whispers, quick and urgent. I turned to leave, heart hammering, when someone spoke behind me, not loudly, not threateningly, just my name. I spun around, flashlight swinging wildly, beam catching a figure crouched low against the wall. He flinched from the light, raising an arm to shield his face. His clothes were layered and filthy, hanging off a body too thin for them. Dirt streaked his skin, and his hair was matted tight to his scalp. Behind him, others shifted in the shadows. They didn't rush me. They didn't scream. They just watched, eyes reflecting dull and wrong in the beam. One of them rocked back and forth, whispering something I couldn't understand. Another clutched a can to his chest like it was precious. "You hear us," the first one said. His voice was hoarse, unused. "We hear you." I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming danger. "I'm leaving," I said, though my voice barely held together. I didn't know anyone was here. A woman stepped forward, her movements jerky and cautious. "You're loud," she said, "up there." Always loud. The realization hit me then, heavy and sickening. The sounds beneath the trailer. The whispers. They weren't echoes. They were responses. I turned and ran. I don't remember how I made it out. I don't remember stumbling back through the woods or slamming the trailer door shut behind me. I just remember sitting on the floor, back against the wall, listening as the night settled in. They were louder after that. The rocks shifted constantly, scraping and tumbling beneath me. Voices rose through the vents, no longer cautious. They argued about me, about the trailer, about the noise. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they called my name over and over until it lost all meaning. I stopped going to work. I stopped answering my phone. I barely slept. Every night, I waited for the sound of someone climbing up from beneath the floor. One night, I heard knocking. Not on the door, from underneath, slow, deliberate. A rhythm that made my stomach twist. I grabbed what little I could carry, keys shaking in my hand, and fled the trailer without looking back. I drove until the road turned to pavement and the trees thinned enough that I could breathe again. I never went back. A month later, I heard the trailer had burned down. Electrical fire, they said. The mine collapsed not long after, sealing itself for good. They found no bodies. No signs of anyone living there. Sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear rocks shifting in my dreams. I hear my name whispered from beneath the ground, and I wonder how many others are still down there, living beneath places no one wants, waiting for someone loud enough to notice. Story 5E, the woman at the bus stop. That route wasn't supposed to be permanent. It was something I picked up when the company was short drivers. A temporary assignment running an early, morning line through a stretch of Appalachia most folks only passed through on their way somewhere else. The pay wasn't great, but the hours were steady, and I liked starting before dawn. There was something honest about being awake while the rest of the world slept, about watching the mountains slowly come back to life as the sky lightened. I told myself that's why I didn't mind the isolation, the long miles of empty road, the way the forest pressed close on both sides like it was listening. The bus stop sat in a place that barely deserved the name. No bench, no shelter, just a leaning metal sign bolted into the gravel shoulder where the road curved along a tree line. Beyond it, the woods dropped off into a shallow hollow choked with brush and old growth. There were no houses nearby, no driveways, no reason for anyone to be standing there at that hour. The schedule said it was active, though, so I stopped there every morning, doors hissing open to let out warm air, even though no one ever got on. The first time I saw her, I thought she was a trick of the light. It was just before 6, the sky still a dull gray, fog clinging low to the ground. She stood a few feet back from the road, right beside the sign, barefoot on the cold gravel. She wore a thin dress that looked like it might have been white once, hanging loose and damp around her knees. Her hair was long and tangled, falling forward to hide most of her face. She wasn't looking at the bus when I pulled up. She was turned toward the woods, head tilted slightly, like she was listening to something just beyond the trees. I slowed to a stop, doors opening out of habit. "You getting on?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. She didn't move. I waited a few seconds, then cleared my throat and called again. Nothing. She didn't even flinch. Eventually, I shut the doors and pulled away, watching her in the side mirror as the bus lumbered forward. She didn't look back. She just stood there, motionless, staring into the forest. I told myself she was probably homeless. Or mentally ill. The mountains have a way of hiding people the rest of the world forgets about. By the time I reached the next stop, I'd already started convincing myself I hadn't seen anything that strange. She was there again the next morning. Same spot. Same dress. Bare feet planted on gravel that had to be freezing at that hour. The fog was thicker that day, curling around her calves, swallowing the lower half of her body. She stood in the same position, facing the trees, shoulders slightly hunched. This time, when I stopped, I noticed her hands. They were clenched tight at her sides, knuckles pale, nails dark with dirt. "You okay?" I asked softer this time. She turned her head just enough that I could see part of her face. Not her eyes, just the line of her cheek, the hollow beneath it. Her skin looked gray in the low light, stretched too tight. Her mouth was slightly open, lips cracked, like she'd been breathing through it for a long time. She didn't answer. She didn't move toward the bus. I pulled away again, unease settling in my chest like a stone. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting her to start running after me, but the road behind stayed empty. After that, she became part of the route. Every morning, right on time, she was there. Sometimes it was foggy. Sometimes rain slicked the road and soaked her hair until it clung to her neck. Once, after a cold snap, I saw frost on the gravel around her feet, but she didn't react to it. She never wore shoes. Never carried a bag. Never stepped forward when the bus stopped. She just stood there, eyes fixed on the woods, like she was waiting for something to come out. I asked around at the depot if anyone knew about her. Most of the other drivers didn't run that far out, but one older guy frowned when I mentioned the stop. "People don't use that one," he said. "Hasn't been anyone there in years." "There's a woman," I told him. "Every morning." He stared at me for a moment, then shook his head. "You sure you're not mixing it up with another stop?" I wasn't. By the second week, I started dreading that stretch of road. The forest felt heavier there, darker somehow, even in daylight. The trees grew close together, branches tangled overhead, blocking out the sky. Sound behaved strangely too. Sometimes I'd hear what I thought was movement, footsteps, maybe, but when I looked, there was nothing there. The woman never acknowledged me beyond those brief glances. I started noticing small changes, though. One morning, her dress was torn at the hem, threads hanging loose. Another day, there was a dark smear on her calf that looked like dried blood or mud. Her hair grew more matted as the days went on, clumping together in ways that suggested it hadn't been brushed in a very long time. The worst part was the feeling. Every time I stopped there, it felt like someone else was watching too. Not from the road. From the woods. The hairs on my arms would lift, my skin prickling like I was standing too close to something alive and dangerous. I'd scan the tree line, but all I ever saw were shadows and tangled undergrowth. One morning, I noticed footprints. They were faint, pressed into the damp soil near the edge of the gravel. Bare feet, toes spread wide, heels deep. There was more than one set. They led away from the road and into the trees, disappearing where the ground dropped into the hollow. The woman stood at the same spot, unmoving. I didn't ask her about the footprints. I didn't ask her anything after that. I just stopped, waited my required minute, and drove on, heart hammering until the road widened and the trees thinned. The day everything changed started like any other. Overcast, cool, the air heavy with the promise of rain. I was running a few minutes behind, coffee sloshing in the cup holder as I navigated the curves. As I came around the bend toward that stop, my stomach tightened. She wasn't alone. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The fog was thick that morning, drifting in slow, lazy sheets across the road and into the woods. The woman stood by the sign like always, barefoot and still. But behind her, just inside the tree line, there were shapes. People. They stood partially hidden by trunks and brush, bodies angled toward the road. Some were crouched low. Others stood stiff and upright, heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their clothes were layered and filthy, hanging off them in ways that didn't fit. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I didn't need to. I could feel their attention like pressure against my skin. I slowed the bus, hands slick on the wheel. The woman turned her head fully toward me for the first time. Her eyes were open wide, whites showing all around, pupils too dark in the dim light. She smiled. It wasn't wide or friendly, just a thin stretching of her lips, like she was remembering how it was supposed to look. The bus doors hissed open. No one moved to board. The figures in the woods shifted, branches snapping softly under their weight. One stepped forward just enough that I could see his bare feet on the dirt, toes curled slightly like they weren't used to standing on anything solid. Another leaned out from behind a tree, hair hanging in his face, eyes fixed on the bus. My chest tightened. I realized then that they were all looking at me, not the bus. Me. I slammed the doors shut and hit the gas. The bus lurched forward, engine groaning as it climbed the slight incline. In the mirror, I saw movement, bodies stepping closer to the road, the woman still standing at the sign, smiling as the bus pulled away. I didn't stop again on that route. I called it in as soon as I reached the next town, voice shaking as I told the dispatcher I wasn't going back out there. I didn't know how to explain what I'd seen without sounding crazy, so I stuck to the basics. Unsafe conditions, people in the road. I expected pushback, questions. Instead, there was a long pause. "Okay," she said finally. "We'll reroute." That was it. Later that day, curiosity got the better of me. I stopped at a small diner near the edge of that stretch, the kind of place locals linger over coffee. I asked the waitress, careful with my words, if anyone lived near that bus stop in the woods. Her expression changed immediately. "You shouldn't be stopping there," she said quietly. "Haven't you heard?" I shook my head. She glanced around, then leaned closer. "People disappear out there. Folks say they follow the wrong thing, or they wait too long. Some never come back. Some do, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "They're not right." I asked her about the woman. She swallowed. "There's been talk. For years. A girl went missing decades ago. Waiting for a ride, they say. Others too. People who just stayed." I didn't sleep much after that. A week later, I drove past that road in my own car, broad daylight, telling myself I just wanted to see if the stop was still there. The sign was gone. Bent and torn out of the ground, tossed into the ditch. The gravel shoulder was overgrown, weeds pushing up through cracks like it had been abandoned for years, but the woods looked the same. As I slowed, I caught movement at the edge of the trees. A flash of pale fabric. Then nothing. I kept driving. Sometimes when I'm out early and the fog is thick, I think about that woman standing barefoot on the gravel, staring into the forest. I think about the others behind her, waiting their turn. And I wonder how many mornings she stood there alone before she wasn't. How long she waited for something that never came. When the world goes quiet around me, when I feel that familiar pressure of being watched, I grip the wheel a little tighter and remind myself to keep moving. Because in those mountains, stopping can be the worst mistake you make. Story 6C. Knock once if you're lost. I only agreed to watch the house because it was supposed to be easy. A week, maybe 10 days at most. My friend Caleb had picked up a last-minute contract out of state and needed someone to keep an eye on his place while he was gone. Feed the dog next door once a day, make sure the pipes didn't freeze, that sort of thing. He lived deep in the mountains, the kind of place where directions include phrases like, "after the third cattle gate," and "when the road stops being paved." I'd grown up not far from there, so the isolation didn't scare me. If anything, I welcomed it. I was tired, burned out, and the idea of quiet nights and no cell service sounded like rest. The cabin sat alone at the end of a narrow gravel drive, surrounded by dense hardwood forest that climbed steeply up the ridges on all sides. It was old but solid, built by hand decades ago, with thick logs and a stone chimney that looked like it had been there longer than the road. The nearest neighbor was miles away. During the day, it felt peaceful. Birds, wind in the leaves, the low hum of insects. At night, though, the dark pressed close. The trees blocked the moon, and the woods seemed to swallow sound instead of carrying it. The first couple of nights passed without incident. I settled into a routine. Lock up before dark. Keep the porch light on. Double. Check the doors even though Caleb had laughed when I mentioned it. "Nothing out there but deer and old ghosts," he'd said. I told myself the same thing when the house creaked and popped after midnight. When branches scrape the siding in the wind, old cabins make noise, mountains shift. That's what I told myself. On the third night, I woke up just after 3 in the morning to a sound that didn't fit. Knock, not loud, not urgent, just a single deliberate knock on the front door. I lay there for a moment, heart thudding, listening. The cabin went still around me, like it was holding its breath. I waited for another knock, for a voice, for anything that would make sense of it. After a long pause, just when I started to convince myself I'd dreamed it knock, same rhythm, same spot, I sat up slowly, every nerve screaming that something was wrong. No one comes up that road at 3 a.m. No one walks miles through the woods in the dark to knock politely on a cabin door. I slid out of bed and grabbed my phone. No signal. The house felt colder than it should have, the air heavy and damp. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I don't know why. Some instinct told me not to. I moved down the hall, bare feet silent on the worn wood floor, and stopped just short of the front door. The porch light was on, casting a dull yellow glow through the frosted glass. "Hello," I called, hating how thin my voice sounded. Nothing. I stepped closer and leaned toward the peephole. At first, all I saw was the porch boards and the edge of the railing. Then something shifted. A man was crouched low, too low for a normal stance, like he was squatting on his heels. His face was angled down, close to the door, and his shoulders were hunched forward in a way that made his arms hang oddly. He wasn't looking at the peephole. He wasn't looking at the door at all. He was sniffing. I could hear it faintly through the wood. Slow, deliberate inhales, like he was testing the air. My stomach turned. "Can I help you?" I asked, louder now, trying to sound firm. His head tilted slightly, like he'd heard something interesting. His mouth moved, lips pulling back just enough for me to see teeth that looked too large in the porch light. "Lost," he whispered. The word slid under the door like a draft. His eyes never met mine. They stayed unfocused, drifting across the porch, the doorframe, the darkness beyond. I realized then that he wasn't looking for help. He was listening, smelling, waiting for something. I didn't open the door. I backed away slowly, every step feeling like it might make noise that would give me away. I retreated down the hall and locked myself in the bedroom, pushing the dresser in front of the door even though it felt ridiculous. I sat on the bed with my back against the wall, listening. Minutes passed. Then longer. I expected more knocking, scratching, a shout. But there was nothing. Just the forest outside and the steady pounding of my own heart. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke up, it was daylight. Pale morning sun filtered through the curtains, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself it had all been a dream. I moved the dresser, opened the bedroom door, and walked toward the front of the cabin. The door was still locked. When I opened it, my breath caught. The wood was covered in scratches. Deep ones, gouged into the surface from bottom to top, overlapping and chaotic. Long streaks where something had dragged nails, or something like nails, upward again and again. The handle was scuffed. The frame splintered in places. Whatever had been out there hadn't knocked just twice. It had stayed. I called Caleb as soon as I got a bar of service, pacing the porch and scanning the tree line. I told him what happened, leaving out the part about the man sniffing the door, because I didn't know how to explain it. He went quiet for a long moment. "You sure it wasn't a bear?" he asked finally. "Bears don't knock," I said. "And they don't whisper." Another pause. "Look, if you're uncomfortable, I'm fine." I lied. "Just wanted to let you know." He didn't push it. We hung up, and I spent the rest of the day trying to scrub the scratches, but the marks were too deep. By evening, I gave up and told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. One more night. I could handle that. I locked every door and window before dark. I kept the lights on. I sat on the couch with a kitchen knife on the table, feeling stupid and scared in equal measure. The woods outside seemed louder than before. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. At exactly 3 a.m., the knocking came again. Knock, pause. This time, I didn't move. I didn't answer. I just sat there, staring at the door, willing it to stay closed. After the second knock, there was a soft sound, like fingers brushing the wood. Then a whisper, closer than before. "Lost." I don't know how long it went on. The scratching was quieter this time, slower, more deliberate. Like he was learning the shape of the door, testing it. When it finally stopped, the silence felt worse than the noise. In the morning, the scratches were fresh, deeper. That was the last night I stayed there. I packed my things at dawn and drove out without looking back. Caleb came home to an empty cabin and a note. I didn't explain everything. I just said I couldn't do it anymore. Months have passed since then. I try not to think about that night, about the way the man's eyes never focused, about the sound of his breathing through the door. But sometimes, when I'm half asleep, I hear it again. One knock, long pause, another knock, and I wonder how many doors he's standing behind now, crouched low in the dark, waiting for someone who decides to answer. Story 70. What lives passed the last fence? I grew up on that land, or at least close enough to it that I thought I understood it. My family's property sat at the edge of a long stretch of Appalachian backcountry, the kind of place where fences didn't so much divide ownership as mark how far people were willing to go. Beyond our last fence line, the woods rose steeper, darker, older. My grandfather used to say the mountain changed past that point. Not magically, just differently. He told me to hunt where I wanted, walk where I pleased, but to never cross that final fence, unless I had a damn good reason and daylight to burn. I laughed it off when I was younger. Old men always have lines they don't want crossed. By the time this happened, he'd been dead 5 years. I was living alone in the old cabin then, the same one he'd built with my father back when the logging roads still got regular use. Most of the neighbors had moved away or passed on. The nearest occupied house was miles down a twisting gravel road that washed out every spring. I liked it that way. The quiet, the routine. I worked seasonal jobs and hunted to fill the freezer. The woods were familiar to me, like a second language I'd spoken all my life. That fall had been lean. Deer sign was light on my usual trails, and what tracks I did find never seemed to lead anywhere. It was like the animals were skirting something, moving around an invisible center I couldn't see. I started ranging farther each week, following ridge lines I hadn't walked since I was a teenager, pushing closer and closer to that last fence without really meaning to. The fence itself was old barbed wire, sagging between gray posts, half swallowed by vines and rust. It ran crooked along the property line, more suggestion than barrier. On my side, the woods were open and familiar, oak and hickory, leaves crunching underfoot, bird calls I could name without thinking. On the other side, the trees grew thicker, closer together, their trunks darker with moss. The ground dropped off sharply, and the air always felt cooler there, even on warm days. The morning I crossed it, I told myself it was just for a better vantage point. I'd tracked a buck along the ridge and lost it right near the fence. The prints veered off, then disappeared entirely, like the animal had taken flight. I stood there for a long time, rifle resting against my shoulder, listening. No birds, no squirrels. Just the faint sound of wind moving high in the canopy. I remember thinking how quiet it was, even for that early hour. I stepped over the fence. The difference was immediate. The forest felt tighter, closer, like it leaned in around me. The ground was softer, damp in a way my side never was, and my boots sank slightly with each step. The smell changed too, less leaf rot, more something metallic and sour. I moved slowly, scanning for sign, trying to convince myself I was imagining the shift. I hadn't gone far when I saw the first bones. They hung from a low branch about chest height, strung together with twine that looked handmade, fibers rough and uneven. At first, I thought it was an old hunting marker, maybe some kind of folk charm left by someone decades ago. Then I got closer. They were human. Finger bones, yellowed with age, tied carefully end to end. They clacked softly against each other when the wind moved them, a dry, hollow sound that raised the hair on my arms. Beneath them, the ground was bare, scuffed clean of leaves like people passed through there often. I stood frozen, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. Grave robbing crossed my mind. Some sick joke, but the care in the arrangement stopped that line of thought cold. This wasn't random. It wasn't careless. It was deliberate. As I looked around, I realized the bones weren't alone. Further into the trees, I could see more shapes hanging at different heights. A rib cage suspended between two saplings. A femur tied with strips of cloth that fluttered slightly in the breeze. Skulls, bleached pale, facing outward from the center of a rough clearing like sentinels, not trophies. Not decorations, markers, warnings. My mouth went dry. I became acutely aware of how loud my breathing sounded, how heavy my rifle felt in my hands. Every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around, to go back the way I'd come and never think about this place again. That's when I heard the movement. At first, it was so subtle I almost missed it, a soft rustle, like leaves shifting under careful feet. Then another from a different direction. I slowly turned my head, scanning the trees. Nothing obvious moved. No bodies stepped into view. But I could feel it then, the way you feel eyes on your back without seeing them. A sound drifted through the woods. A bird call. It was wrong. Too slow. Too deliberate. The pitch was close, but the rhythm was off, like someone who'd heard a bird once and was trying to remember how it went. A moment later, another answered from deeper in the trees. Then another, closer to my left. They weren't birds. I realized that at the same time the voices started, low chatter, barely above a whisper, weaving between the trees. I couldn't make out words at first, just cadence and breath. Human voices trying very hard not to sound human. Some clicked their tongues. Others whistled softly. One let out a broken laugh that cut off too fast. I slowly lowered my rifle, afraid the movement would draw attention. My pulse roared in my ears. I wanted to shout, to demand to know who was out there, but the words died in my throat. This wasn't a situation you confronted. This was something you survived by not being noticed. The chatter grew louder. I caught fragments then, half-formed words, repeated sounds. One voice mimicked the creak of a tree limb. Another whispered something that might have been my name, or might have just sounded like it. I couldn't be sure. The uncertainty was worse than clarity. I took one careful step back. The voices paused, not stopped. Paused, like a room going quiet when someone enters unexpectedly. I waited, barely breathing, muscles screaming with tension. Then, from somewhere behind me, came another bird call, close enough that I felt it more than heard it. My skin crawled. I resisted the urge to spin around, knowing sudden movement would be the end of me. I took another step back, slow enough that my boots barely disturbed the leaves. The chatter resumed, faster now, overlapping. The bird calls grew more frequent, coming from all sides. I realized then that they were communicating, tracking my movement without revealing themselves fully. Hurting me. My mind raced, dredging up forgotten stories my grandfather used to tell by the fire. Not ghost stories. Worse. Stories about people who went too far into the mountains and learned how to live without roads, without rules. Folks who didn't want to be found and made sure no one came looking twice. I backed away inch by inch, eyes locked on the bone markers, using them as anchors so I wouldn't panic. My legs trembled, threatening to give out. I imagined what would happen if I tripped, if I fell and made noise. The thought tightened my chest until it hurt. A voice rose above the rest, clearer. Closer, it mimicked a crow this time, harsh and sharp, then broke into a whisper halfway through, like whoever made it forgot what they were pretending to be. The sound came from my right, just beyond a stand of young pines. I could see branches moving there now, swaying without wind. I took another step back and felt the wire of the fence press against my calf. Relief surged through me so hard I almost cried. I was closer to my side of the line than I'd realized. Maybe they wouldn't cross it. Maybe the fence meant something to them, the same way it had to my grandfather. The chatter shifted again, rising in pitch, frustration creeping in. One of the voices let out a sharp bark of sound that echoed too loud, too raw. The branches shook harder now, bodies moving unseen just out of view. I stepped back over the fence. The effect was immediate. The voices didn't stop, but they pulled back, receding slightly, like a tide hitting a wall. The bird calls grew sporadic, uncertain. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and walked, then jogged, then ran. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin, lungs burning, heart threatening to tear itself out of my chest. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, sliding to the floor as my legs finally gave out. I sat there shaking for a long time, listening to the familiar sounds of my side of the woods. Birds returned slowly. Squirrels chattered. Life resumed like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. In the days that followed, I found signs near the fence. Fresh footprints, barefoot, toes spread wide. Twine scraps caught on the wire. Once, I found a small bundle hanging just inside my side of the trees, a single finger bone tied with cloth and left where I couldn't miss it. A message. I reinforced the fence after that. New posts. Fresh wire. I stopped hunting anywhere near it. Eventually, I sold the property and moved away, telling myself I was ready for something different, somewhere less isolated. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of that clearing, of the bones swaying gently in the wind, of voices trying to remember how birds sound. I wake up with the sense of being counted, measured. Some places don't want witnesses. They want continuity. And I know, deep down, that whatever lives past that last fence is still there, patient as the mountains themselves, waiting for the next person who decides to step just a little too far.